All right, Brian, it's all you. We are in session two for today, so thank you all for coming. Brian Lee is our presenter.
Thank you, Kristen. Welcome, everybody. My name is Brian Lee, and I have a couple of sets of responsibilities, but one of them is I'm a lecturer at the Milgard School of Business in the Data Analytics program, and I also in my day job I work as a director of technology, and so it gives me kind of this window in both worlds of what do we manage in technology, and also get an opportunity to sit down with students and talk through things like how do we use these technologies in the real world and in the workplace. One of the reasons I really like working with MBA students in general is it's not just technical students. These are students that come from finance programs and marketing programs, and really what they're trying to do is get a handle on how to use these technologies as enablers in the workplace. And of course, one of the biggest, newest areas of technology that is really impacting all of these worlds is AI. And specifically the kinds of AI tools that businesses are adopting and that they're expecting individuals to have some experience with. The generation and the thought of this course actually came from about the last fall. I was in a group of CEOs, and they were speaking about what it is that their expectations were when it came to AI and what they wanted from the workforce going forward. And like many of you, I had sat for a couple of years now in faculty groups where a lot of the discussion was around just getting our hands around the concept of what AI means for us and the institutions and finally the students that we're working with. But being in that room with the CEOs, it was interesting because what they were talking about, and if I had to sum up what the whole presentation was about and their opinions, it was we have the tools, we are investing in the tools, and what we want from the workforce is to deliver the value. And that stuck with me. And as I started participating pretty regularly with faculty members, I wanted to kind of impress on everyone, hey, this is happening in the workforce already. And there are missed opportunities for us if we're not putting out students who can cope with and utilize these particular tools because their bosses, the folks that are investing in these tools and that are buying into, in some cases, the hype of how exciting it is that all this value can be delivered from them, and that there's a gap if the students that we're producing as graduates are not emerging into the workforce with at least a working knowledge of how to apply them. So that's really where this course came from. It was me insisting to Milgard, hey, we can go back and forth on this all that we want, but the fact of the matter is where every cohort that graduates that doesn't have the skills to be able to use this is going to be at a deficit versus the jobs that they're trying to move into and what their employers really are asking them in this instance. So we knew there was a need. We knew that students were entering the workforce where AI was becoming part of how work done is getting done. And we also knew the employers were actually trying to figure out what these tools meant for productivity and decision making and risk for that workforce. So it isn't as though the students were emerging into the workforce where the employers knew even what they were going to ask students to do. And so I believe that that gave students a little bit of agency. If we could train them on how to do this pretty well, then the students themselves could go in and essentially pitch to employers where the value in productivity would come from in this case. So it wasn't about waiting until everything was perfectly aligned. It was building a course that was going to be able to really work with this changing dynamic and environment, um, and to talk about not just what students would need moving into the workplace, but actually practice those skills. So when I say applied AI, I really mean that the goal for me for these students was to walk out and have specific school skills that they could deliver to those employers, present in an interview, to make a pitch even to their current employers in this case. So I think that one of the most important lessons from this experience is that we don't have to wait until our organizations, our institutions are entirely figured out. I don't think we have that luxury. I think we can start in a highly experimental environment, much like our research areas do often, and sort of prove that ground with the students that we have now. Um, and so that's kind of the idea of that was behind this course and where I thought it could move us in this instance. So this session is really about just figuring or sorry, I think I went ahead too. Yeah, I did. No, I did. There we go. So this session is really about providing context, design, evidence, and transfer of the background architecture for what would become the course, not only the course design, but I think I'll be able to also talk through some of the opportunities that we have, no matter what the subject area is. So I don't want it to turn folks off with like, hey, these were MBA students and I work with undergraduates, or this was in a STEM area or a technical area, and I work in the humanities. I think that the problem-solving methodology that was built into the way this course works could be applied in many different ways, and that is whether you choose to apply it for a small exercise within the larger context of a course, or whether you want to architect the entire course around the sort of problem-solving methodologies and prototyping that we put in place for this course. The premise was actually intentionally simple. I knew I was going to be working with non-technical folks, and that it wasn't going to be a computer science course. It's not going to be an AI theory course. And it's definitely not going to be a tour of whatever AI tools happen to be popular that month, because we can't keep up with all of the, and we saw even with the tools we were using in the course that changes were occurring while the course was running in this environment. So instead, I really wanted the students to develop the ability to look at a real organizational problem and ask what I think is a more useful question. Could AI actually help here? And if it could, what would it look like? What would we need to build? What do we need to know? What could go wrong? Where's the risk in this scenario? And ultimately, as you see, we're gonna go through this particular course to achieve, should an organization actually do it? And one thing I try to impress on the students, you'll see a little bit later, is just because you get a working prototype and you invested a whole lot of time in it doesn't mean you should say yes, or even recommend it. That your reputation as someone working in that organization is going to be important, is going to be built on this. So right now it's very easy to build AI courses, I think, around tools. You got ChatGPT and Copilot and Claude and Perplexity and all of these elements. Here's image generation, here's an outline of material, here's plenty of examples. In this case, here's that last thing that just showed up Tuesday afternoon. But the problem with designing a course around those elements is that it gives the course itself an extraordinarily short shelf life, I think. And so what I wanted the durable part of the course to be, despite the changing landscape of tools, is the thinking, right? To really see the tools as enabling the thought process in this instance. And so, it kind of lets me move on to this concept of like, if the course is coming together quickly and we need applied learning now and no mature template exists, I can't wait for this perfect plan. And so that's kind of the idea behind it. And I was curious about whether there would be strong student interest. And so I wrote this like course outline that I sold to the dean and a course description for a 590 course, which for us is a special topics course. And it was going to be a 2-credit elective for MBAs, meaning they have no reason to take it other than their own interest, right? And so we put it out there. We were wondering if there's student interest. There was definitely clear workforce relevance. I think that was sellable. And then this opportunity to pilot something without even pretending like there's a mature discipline around it, right? So that would be kind of the background piece of it. AI was used extensively in the development of the course materials. I could brainstorm structures, I could critique activities, generate variations, revise the materials, and move a lot faster than I could without any sort of a collective element that would help me move fast. But that isn't, I think, the interesting part of the story. The interesting part is what happened when the course actually reached the students. And the first way that it reached the students was we advertised that it was going to be taught. Within about, it must have been probably 2 weeks of priority registration occurring for those students, I got a notice from the dean saying we're going to have to open a second course section. So the first demand test actually was met, and it was this idea of, in economics we have to call about pent-up demand, right? That students recognized that somebody was teaching in a course that had relevance to something they were going to need. And so not only did I have 2 course sections now, I had the first MBA course section, I mean the students were about to graduate, wanted a course. Then the second set was the first group of MBA students. So the first year and second year MBA students were both interested in this particular topic. when it came to the actual course design itself, the course actually became an OER course almost by necessity because I didn't want students buying certain. I'm not even sure if there is. I didn't even bother looking for an AI textbook. Even if there was or is, it's probably going to be outdated by even the time the term ended. So it had to live in Canvas. It had to use openly available reports and articles, videos, research, public frameworks. I wanted a methodology that allowed for the course materials to be something students would interact with, draw conclusions from, and then see that it moved toward that sort of applied target that we were trying to hit. And so what's good about this there's, I suppose there's good and bad, right? There's not a lot of research material that MBA students could probably process that points to results. There's starting to be more of it, but there was a lot of white papers that were being produced by Google and Anthropic and so forth on the way that they're sort of these early stage, what you think is kind of results driven elements that were part of the course. Most all of them were freely available, so that helped in terms of what we could put together. One of the materials that I've provided for this particular piece is every one of the and I have an annotated bibliography that lists all of the elements that I looked at and provided in the course itself. And most of these were elements that were students would read them, discuss them, and then we would meet together in class. And what was this actually happened several times during the course. When I found a better example, I could actually just replace the old one that was there. So what made this course particularly difficult to deliver was I was usually reviewing resources in real time. And as long as the students hadn't gotten to the content yet, so if it was, if I'm in week 3 and there's something I'm looking at that would be relevant to week 5, I would actually sub it out. And AI really helps with this because I could go to ChatGPT and say, I have a new resource I'd like to substitute. Give me the pre-page so in Canvas, the actual page I want to lay out, the link to that material and so forth. And so I could do that in real time. This is not something I could have done without help, because it required those fast turnarounds in a case like this. When I saw new capabilities, I could incorporate them into the course. When something stopped being useful or was outdated, I didn't have to spend time the rest of the quarter teaching around a textbook chapter that I didn't believe represented the field anymore. And that actually happened a couple of times as there were tool changes, especially for Codex and Claude that were happening as this as the topic was really rapidly changing. So it isn't just this flexibility that was required because we thought it was a good idea. It was required because this is actually part of the instructional infrastructure. So this is actually what the course roadmap looks like. I'll talk about a couple of structures here that were unique to our situation. So the first thing you'll notice that there's a little gray weeks that are in here, this opening buffer. These were because I was teaching a 2-credit elective course for MBA students who went to school only on Saturdays. That meant that I actually only had 1, 2, 3 in-person sessions available for us to meet. So for me, it was actually important to honor these spacing weeks. These spacing weeks that you see here were there because they were in the other MBA courses that they were taking. And I wanted to make sure I didn't give them any work during that time frame. So there's a course outline that stretches across these weeks. And even in Canvas, I built a module that just said, hey, you don't have anything to do here. I want to make it clear that nobody had any business to take care of and that I wasn't scheduling anything. So the way that I had to kind of think of the course was really as these sort of essentially these 7 class elements, right? An in-person session, an asynchronous module, a second asynchronous module, another in-person session, a third asynchronous module, a third in-person session, and then a fourth asynchronous module, right? And how I wanted to use that time. But generally, this was the pattern of the weeks across the course. And the broad outline that I came up with of how I would use the time was really down here at the bottom. So this idea of setting up a business problem, of creating what I called the opportunity canvas. The opportunity canvas for us was like a Kanban board where you just go and you say, like, what's out there? What business problems that we want to solve? Overwhelmingly, my students were employed, right? They're actually working in environments. And so I encourage them to use their employers as the essential use cases that they would try to work through in this instance. And what I didn't try to make every week do was I didn't think that every week needed to be some new AI topic, but what we would do is we would build this sort of slow process of of what does it do? What does AI do for us? How can it solve problems? What are the preliminary solutions to what problem we're trying to solve? Let's create a prototype. And this prototyping methodology, I'll go into a little bit of detail because I think it's an essential element that can be very useful. It's something that we typically do in technology development, but that I think can help with anyone. And it's not hard to understand. The concept of building a prototype is very simple. Whatever tools that you have available to you, you try to use them to solve a real problem. And so you come up with these candidate solutions, not perfect solutions, not things that you're ready to roll out and that are entirely complete, but rather something that you have as a saleable proof of concept. And that was the target that most of these students were trying to hit in this case. We went through in week 8 the sort of feasibility readiness discussions, which includes a lot of topics like risk, and what would make it risky to deploy this in your environments. Then they presented their solution. So our final class meeting really focused on getting in there and saying, and I'll show you this detail in a second, but how do we pitch this idea to your boss, which is basically where we would end up in this third person scenario. And then finally some reflection here. I wanted them to think about like the whole process from all the way from what did you think at the beginning to where did you land with your solution, and how does it actually work in this case. So it probably sounds pretty straightforward, but this concept of whether AI can represent a plausible intervention is going to be a theme that the students are consistently having to revisit. And I think it's actually one of the most important concepts in the course, because the students and their organizations, for that matter, actually say we have AI now, right? And then they go directly to what can we use it for. But I wanted them to reverse that thinking to what's the problem, what's the decision, what's the friction, and what information is available in this case for us to create some kind of outcome, right? And what is that outcome that we want to create? So that's the theme of that whole lower section that you see here. Because if that's the case, then we need all of that preliminary thinking to decide what technology belongs in the solution, and people in process were a key part of the discussions that we were having in this case. So I would be remiss if I didn't introduce the humans that were part of this story, right? The two core sections that were created. So the left-hand side is the picture of the graduating cohort, that smaller cohort, and the first-year cohort is on the right-hand side. The funny story about these pictures is I fully intended in our last class meeting to take a picture of the class, and we got so busy that I just forgot to actually do it. And so we happen to have in our Canvas the ability to it's supposed to build, I think the use case was supposed to be for seating charts, but it shows us the students' ID pictures. And so I snagged their ID pictures in a seating chart download and had AI build it into something that, or in this case, ChatGPT, build it into something that allowed me to put their pictures in this case. So it was just, again, it was me forgetting to do something, but then I pulled it out in this case. Yeah, the interesting part about this dog is that Yayoi, the student, she actually works for, and this was the business case that she worked on. She works for an organization that uses that trains service dogs specifically for veterans. And so the use case she came up with, the business problem she was trying to solve was their process is actually quite manual, of people sending them emails and asking questions about program qualification. Now, the advantage is all their program qualification documents are online. And so she was actually able to build a scenario where a chatbot that enabled people to do their pre-qualification through the chatbot using using that online documentation. And so it actually greatly reduces the amount of time that it takes for people to first self-qualify. And what she's hoping is that it will raise the number of applicants who are actually qualified, and they won't have to spend as much time going through and vetting the applications that actually will be people that are going to be disappointed because they don't qualify for the program. So yeah, it's an interesting piece. We got to see two different service dogs then during the course of the term that came by to see us. So what were the students actually working on in this case? And the first is this idea of, what is the problem? What can AI contribute in this case? And so in the middle section, part of the labs that I was working on was helping them work through this discovery process of what AI's capabilities were. And so everybody had almost everyone in the class had used an AI chatbot for the purposes of, creating a work product. That was the sort of minimum entry level layer, as I like to refer to it. Um, but and so a lot of them, at the beginning thought, okay, let's just stick with this work product component, and I'll get into some more complexity as we work through these scenarios as well. We discuss things like responsible use of AI using frameworks like the OECD principles, and you'll see that in the bibliography later. We looked at privacy, bias, reliability, security, sustainability, governance, and human oversight. Where does the human belong in the loop in this scenario? And in the concept of the prototype itself, we needed to filter it through those organizational risk parameters and organizational readiness determinations in order for the prototype to have meaning. And that was something that was important to me. I didn't want them to just sit there and say that because we've developed a prototype with some capability, the organization's ready for this. And that was part of that second class meetings last half, where we focused in on this idea of like, okay, you've got a prototype. Can you literally go to your boss and credibly stake your reputation on the idea that this prototype is ready to go? So that's could be a particular problem, as any of us would think in this scenario. And so the drive is to get to point five. Yes, you have come up with a prototype that you feel a lot of confidence in, but what should your managers do next? And what are you recommending to them? So anchor session one was really about framing the work before we test the tool. We actually got a chance to think through things like, and I'll skip to the what they practiced in this session. We know that prediction and judgment are two different things. And so we saw that the AI tool itself was actually quite good at predicting, but not great at judgment. And that was across a broad set of AI tools. So I didn't force a specific tool in this case. I'll talk about that when we get to the results section. But I think it was important in many cases to understand that students were using different tools in this instance. And the purpose of the prototype itself is that it needed to drive as a learning instrument, the exposure of assumptions, the presence of limitations, where data may be missing, and so forth. So we did work on these things like, once we know it can predict, we need to remain in the driver's seat when it comes to judgment. We worked a lot on prompt refinement. So prompt refinement for a particular purpose, which might mean, are we refining our prompts to get a work product out of the deal? Or are we doing it for the purposes of developing something else? We also looked for opportunities through that back and forth and asking additional questions in prompting for where is missing data. What models are out there to explain the kinds of conclusions that a particular instrument or a particular model might derive for us. Look for workflow problems. A lot of our students started with the idea that they felt like they were going to come up with a work product output. And through the dialogue of exploring the problem with their AI tool, they actually indicated that they were workflow issues, right? And so, for instance, I'll give the example of the prior example where we are talking about with the VA service dog program. Part of the issue she needed to solve wasn't about could people send them applications. It's what the team did with the applications afterward that were a key part of that issue. And she learned a lot in that dialogue about how to streamline a workflow process, how to make it simpler, and so forth in this instance. And so this concept of scoping the problem really became very, very much one of defining what it is we're going to produce and how it's going to solve that problem going forward. And I think that what this really does for us is it exposes the difference between something that sounds good in a proposal and what actually works when the team itself is going to have to do it. A prototype isn't about perfection. It's about this idea of what we can learn as an organization and what we can deploy in this case. What I think is also important about the practical side of this is that in the prototyping session, so let me move forward to talking about how prototyping actually worked for us, is they don't need to be programmers. They didn't need to build an application. They didn't need to demonstrate the essential behaviors even of a proposed solution. One project might be a carefully generated AI workflow that produces a business deliverable. And these are the four main categories of what students produced in this case. The easiest one, or I kind of think of it as the lowest level project, is work products, right? It's a plan, a report, an analysis, something that looks at data, produces it, and it provides planning and decision support for those individuals, right? The next phase, and a lot of students got really interested in this idea of creating a chatbot, right? The purpose of a chatbots were really the next piece, and we had to divide. So I gave them actually a persona development element that's fairly standard, that's out there. It's called the pentagram, and the pentagram allows you to actually go in and define all the elements of a chatbot's personality and what data it's going to use. And what they were excited about really was the idea that you could dial a chatbot down to only the specific data you wanted to work with. So we actually worked on these in the lab, creating a chatbot that was based on, say, organizational documents, the same way. And I was building on experience where I had used chatbots in my classes that were built just on the class documentation, right? These custom built chatbots specifically for a particular course. And that's where you want users to actually start interacting with, meaning your customers to actually interact with your data. The next piece was agents workflow. So this was the first automations that we would work with, and I showed them how to create autonomous agents. What's interesting about this is where everybody goes, whoa, right? Because you can see an agent work. And so what we did was there was a student who had a particular a problem that he was trying to solve. He actually works for the state of Washington, and they have a new program that's being released to the public, and it has to do with individuals who can get covered, get care covered by it. It's called Walk Cares. And so the Walk Cares program is actually there for caregivers to actually go in and employ and get money from the state for their caregiving responsibilities. And so what he understood was there's a lot of people out there that had questions about how this works. And so he wanted to design a process where the email didn't have to be answered by the individuals in their customer service department. He wanted preliminary emails to come to this chatbot that could answer questions that were easy and covered by the documentation that they already had online. So he spent a lot of time, and I would tell you it was like a wow moment the first time he saw the agent answer the question correctly and link it to the resources online when it was received as an email and responded back to the customer, right? So this was a fun scenario. But of course, if you're already paying attention, you're seeing that what's happening here is that as we're increasing with the tool automation, we're also increasing the risk, right? The ability, so what he would figure out later on was, as wowed as he was by the option of that autonomous system to answer an email, it was going to be super risky for him to deploy that in an environment without human oversight, right? And that'll come later as he applies these sort of risk lenses and so forth to the concept. The last one is the coded solution, probably the hardest. The fewest students engaged in these because it required them to, number one, so this was a deficiency in the course itself, it required them to have access to a coding environment, either Claude Code or Codex, where they could build a solution. But a few students did go this far. They were willing to spend the token credits of their own money in a case like this to actually move in that direction. And it made for the most complex scenarios. But this is where I think the strength really came in for a 2-credit course. For a student to get all the way to a coded solution, this could never happen in any other environment, right? Because we struggle in programming classes to get students to go all the way to some very rudimentary element. And I will show you at the very end what the coded solution actually looked like in this case. And you can imagine the kind of build it would take if you were doing this manually without any AI supported tool. So really, if you're keeping track, we went from business problems to identifying this sort of smallest credible prototype to one of these 4 things that really would be the output that they were working with. And a lot of students would bounce around. As we started talking about risk and where they were headed, they would bounce around from, man, it sounds like an agent workflow would really work. Some of it was also about skill set. I don't feel like I can get the AI to do this, or it's getting harder for me to prompt it into doing this. So they backed off to chatbots or work products, which was all perfectly fine with me. That was all part of the prototyping process that I thought was cool and made it interesting for them to go through. And I also want to kind of point out something at this stage. If you're the kind of instructor, and this is true in a lot of STEM environments, right? And I use technology broadly. I mean, if you're a medical instructor, a dental instructor, you're in a technical environment. It comes with a lot of technical pieces. And a lot of the way we design courses, kind of old school, is we try to control the variables, right? We want the course to kind of exist in this little box, and you're like, okay, I thought of all the ways so I've delivered students this perfect experience, and I want everybody and I want to control the ways it can run off the rails, right? in an environment like this where you're working with AI, things are gonna go in directions you can't anticipate and you cannot control them, right? You really do become the classic guide on the side. I can help try to redirect you back to where you're headed. And students are going to be working in projects of such complexity that it is already, I couldn't sit with a student who produced a coded solution and debug every aspect of where the problems could be in their code, right? All I could do was recommend to them that let's try to get you back on track by using the tools that we have available to us. So that was I want to kind of just I'm nobody's boss, but I want to absolve you of that responsibility of trying to think through like I have to control everything because you don't, right? You can be in this environment and there can be a lot of experimentation. And that was part of the compact that I had with the students at the beginning. I told them this would be a highly experimental course. When this course started, they couldn't even see the final modules because I wasn't sure what was going to go in them yet. And so that gets into this concept of like the building the plane while we're flying it, and it's acknowledging and giving yourself that grace to say, I can't control every aspect of this course because a lot of it is going to be experimental, and saying and agreeing that that's the environment that we're working in. So our anchor session 3 really was about the prototype evidence and then finally getting to this last piece, recommendation, right? And this is where I really wanted them to understand that whatever you've done at this point, you might feel great about it, but you're eventually going to have to stake your reputation with your own boss on whether this should be deployed in your organization. Vahid, I think that's a great point. This is, and I also wanted the students to know that we're all in the same boat, right? This concept of have patience with me. I'm experimenting with things. I will have patience with you. You're going to be experimenting with things and so forth, right? It did help that it was a credit, non-credit course. I will add some props to the university for that thought process because at the end of the day, I probably would have been very I would have been great. I would have been very understanding from a grading perspective, and so the grades are going to be high anyway. And I will tell you, everybody was well above the 90% because they followed the process, right? And it wasn't about trying to even encourage them to get to perfect products and have them know where they would land. Part of that recommendation that you see at the end, and I use this term all over the place, you're not going to try to sell your prototype. You're going to advise the organization. And that could come in any of these elements. So what I've spun out here were the 5 results that could come from exploring a prototype. The prototype could be, I want to recommend, and so the final deliverable in the course was literally a memo recommending their boss on how to proceed. Is it proceed? Is it continue the pilot? Is it revise the pilot to reduce the risk until such time as we think we might could use this idea? Is it pause, right? You encountered some things, and that was part of why that anchor session 3 lecture really focused a lot on risk. Was I want to show you all the ways that these things can run off the rails. It can be risky because of the data they access. They can be risky because you gave an autonomous agent the ability to work with data or exposed it to customers. They can be risky because the organization has no appetite for working with automation at this level. And so pause could definitely be in the mix, right? You may have already exceeded the authority you have for the project, or finally stop, right? You could, I tried to introduce very early on that you can go all the way through this process, and part of what you're going to be recommending is like, whoa, we're not ready, and that it's okay for an organization not to be ready. And several students encountered that. I had a student who was working in a law firm, and she said, wow, this proof of concept is great, but I can't tell anybody about it. And I was like, that's exactly right, right? It's okay. You've done something, you've proved it, you know how it works, you have the skill, but for this particular organization, you're not going to be able to bring this forward, and that's perfectly fine. So, when I think about what OER essentially did for this course, is that it made a lot of these, sorry, I double clicked. It made a lot of this rapid launch capability possible. There was a Canvas delivered course show. There were open articles and reports and videos and public frameworks that were accessible to us. And I think that was great. What we still needed to focus on, so this is kind of me looking backward at what would need to change going forward. There were paid features. Students who might have wanted to go ahead and move forward into a coded solution couldn't. because they didn't have the funds for it, or we didn't have organizational or institutional licenses that would allow that access. The live demos needed free or baseline alternatives. I tried to exercise some care around that to make sure that whatever we were doing wasn't going to cost them anything at the beginning. Any of the advanced capabilities that your tools use should be discussed. And so, there's students can get impressed with a lot of this, but in many cases, they need a framework or ability to kind of move forward in this instance. And the required outcomes actually have to be achievable within that context. And I was okay with that. I believe that every student could get to at least 3 of the options you saw on that previous slide, while with just the free alternatives that they had available. So let me go to the data that students kind of pulled up. What did they say in their post-course evaluation? So, when what the students said worked, overwhelming, we're having hands-on labs. The fact that we could walk through, this was care at the beginning. I really did ask for. I said, hey, I got to teach this course on a computer lab. Partly because I did want it to make sure I could show them a thing, have them try it on their own, show them a thing, have them try it on their own. And so that ended up being a big strength of the course from the student's perspective. There we had working demonstrations. They were able to work through their cases. They could contact me at any time during the asynchronous elements and so forth, about what they needed to do, or what they could do in this case. It also allowed them to kind of go in and ask some of those bigger questions, like, I've gotten a summary or categorization or alternatives from AI in this case, but can I rely on its recommendations? And that, to me, was a tremendously nuanced perspective that was super important, because they were starting to question the output that they were getting from AI and what its recommendations looked like in this case. So when we talk about AI literacy in the workforce writ large, I don't think technical skills really at the root of this. We're talking about students developing the ability when to trust or not trust the technology and what it gives them, when they need to perform the aspects of verification, and when to intervene, and when that human role is actually too important to automate away in this case. So that, I think, that piece was part of it. Some of this. So these were sort of the higher level results in this instance that students gave on a 5 scale about the course. So I think overall they were satisfied, which is always something I'm worried about, right? If somebody's going to spend all their hard-earned tuition money on something, I want to know them to feel like they got some return on investment. I wanted to introduce this particular use case. So this student's name's Gavin. He's one who moved all the way to the end of a coded solution in this element. And he was actually able to present this in a graduate research presentation to the Milgard Executive Council, where he actually had to go in and interact with executives to make these business cases. And what I'll actually do is I'll post in the chat the website. You can see it for yourself. But this was the end result of his project, and it was called Northline. And the purpose of this was to get to provide people with the ability to connect their financial applications all in one place and preview it. I want to set the context for this so you can kind of look through the website and determine, form your own opinions. But this is a finance student with no technical background whose day job, he has a couple of day jobs. He's an entrepreneur, and he owns a business called Bark and Brush, where he does cuts your dog's hair and so forth. So providing grooming services. But he also works his other day job, typical of a business student, right, with a lot of irons in the fire. He works for a loan company in entry level, or he works for Heritage Bank in an entry level loan position. And so, yes, he had the finance background. Yes, he had the background to be able to kind of think through what people might need in this space. But what he didn't have was all these technical skills to be able to produce a product like this, certainly not in a 10-week period, and yet he did, right? And so for me, this was kind of the one of the best examples of where we would end in a course like this. And I want to move forward very quickly, but I want to certainly appreciate that. What did we learn from this in this case? And I want to make sure I leave opportunities for questions as well. So I'm going to finish in about 4 minutes. I think that they asked for more depth. They wanted authentic choice. They wanted compelling demos. These were direct quotes that we got from those. They also said, hey, this is too much for 2 credits, and I can empathize with that. I was trying to hit a sweet spot between I want you to sweat it a little bit, I want the work to be hard. I do, but at the same time, I don't want it to be too much. And I didn't get a sense that it was too much. But I think what they wanted was they actually wanted more things. And there were concerns about the tools, right? Making sure that that tool baseline really wasn't something that was hindering them from being able to move from those tools one for the other in this instance. So that, and again, so these are things that I would need to work on. What would I do different later? I would come up with a common tool baseline. I think it's important that students be working in the same environment, just from a lab management standpoint. In this case, I would get that roadmap out to them early, and this is totally my fault because I was still messing with the latter part of the course when the beginning course the course ran. It didn't create as much course transparency as it really needed to have. So I should have been able to show them like that graphic that I produced at the end, which I didn't even have at the beginning of the course. I should be able to show them the whole thing, and I gave them a very basic template, but I didn't nail down what the end of the course was really going to look like for them. And I think that would have been a huge advantage here of knowing where they were going in this case. Rosemary, these are all generated by ChatGPT. So, and it's because I've had an ongoing dialogue with ChatGPT all the way through this course about creating the course materials and rolling out individual elements. So it already knew it had a long legacy of data that has come out in this particular case that I was able to revisit. So I even just the results of the student surveys I dumped into that same chat project, and so it was able to really use that wealth of data I've been generating all along to give me this kind of summary information. A little bit of logistics, standardizing our final presentations, making those a little more. I gave them an outline to follow. I think they wanted a little more guidance on that piece. And then differentiating between like what's the minimum, the foundational path, as well as the advanced path, right? I had students that self-elected to go into those paths because of the projects that they were working on, but probably acknowledging that these were a little more advanced would have and being able to provide them with the direct assistance of moving into those advanced paths. So by way of a wrap up, I think, if I had to recognize a couple of things that I would want to just tell you as takeaways, focus on these durable outcomes for small, medium, or large projects within the courses. Be ready to experiment, like get out there and have these folks experiment, release some of that tension or anxiety that you might have about trying to come up with a perfect path that students have to walk and control everything. I know that in many cases, we definitely have to we have to control some things when we do labs, but at the end of the day, be happy to have that serendipity occur in a class where it's like, hey, I wasn't expecting that outcome, but here it is. And that happened in a few cases when I was running labs, especially with agents, where I would get outcomes and I would need to refine them. And I would just say to students, hey, I would need to spend more time refining this in order to make that work. But we need to continue our conversation and so forth. Get that launch something within a course. Is it one assignment? Is it a module? Is it a framework like we're talking about here? But then yield to the evidence, right? Collect your feedback. Be willing to tell your students when you think the AI is wrong or when it develops something that's just not practical or not good, or it's off the rails and it's hallucinating. So you're just honest about how difficult it is sometimes to keep your AI solutions on track in these cases, which is always going to be the case. But it's happening because of human reflection in these elements. So, but this is again really kind of my ending slide here. Adapt the model, figure out what your smallest responsible launch profile looks like, and I was kind of just discussing that in this instance. But I really this piece really is what I think resonates for me. We want to wait for institutional AI strategy. We want to wait for perfect approved platforms or policy to settle or governance. We want to wait for the discipline to mature, but we can't actually wait for someone to tell us what AI education is going to look like at this stage, right? That work is absolutely necessary, but institutions need governance, they need strategy, they need privacy and security standards. And as we're developing these things, we want to adhere to those within our own institutions. But I think that the teaching can't wait for every one of those questions to be completely resolved. Our students are already encountering these tools. Their workplaces are using the tools. And increasingly, the question isn't whether they're going to use AI, it's whether or not they know how to use it thoughtfully. And whether or not they can do it in their own organizational context in ways that make sense for both them and the organization. I think you need durable learning outcomes. I think you need an authentic problem. I think you need accessible baselines, some tools that students can work with, and you need structured experimentation. That was a key part of what made this class work. For you, the takeaway I think is you need a willingness to revise your course as the technology changes, as new things happen, as that serendipity I was talking about occurs in the course. Um, so a lot of the excitement I think about tools that we're encountering right now is going to diminish over time, but problem definition is going to matter, evidence is going to matter, judgment in the role of humans is going to matter, and risk is still going to matter when you talk about it in organizational context. So that's the part I think that's durable, that students can take away. I think if we know where we're trying to go and we're willing to keep checking those instruments, to use my flight analogy, I think that that's fine. That's going to make for well-designed courses and well architected experiences for students. So in the time that's left, I'm happy to talk about the course design, dive into the details of the assignments. Please dive, give me questions. I'm happy to answer them. Vahid, I think you're exactly right. And that we're comfortable with that concept of experimentation, right? I think we have to be comfortable in order to make the students comfortable. It's kind of like we heard in a couple of the presentations so far, just acknowledging the presence of AI tools within courses helps take away the stigma, because we know the stigma exists, right? Students are seeing in the literature and the press and in their feeds all the time the tension that exists in academia right now, which is the tension that instructors are having with calling it things like cheating and all of these things, with the demand that workplaces and people have about wanting to use the tools. And we have to be explicit in saying, look, and I say it in every one of my courses, I expect that AI is going to be used in the course, because I can't acknowledge that it gives me a tremendous a tool to use in course design. In another one of my courses, I had a student who was 2 weeks from the end of the term, had 4 weeks of work to do. And I could empathize with that situation. But what I did was I went to ChatGPT and said, here's a list of all the assignments that are left. Here's how much time is left. Give me a plan that allows a student that literally spins it out day by day on what assignment she needs to complete over that time period. And I got it in 30 seconds, right? So I couldn't have done that in any other environment with the volume of responsibilities that I have in this scenario. But it was great. That student made it to the end of the course because I gave her a work plan customized to her for the things that she needed to do. That's great question, Vahid. I didn't, from my perspective, most of the students I saw were using the tools that they had. I saw a lot of Claude. I saw a little bit of Copilot because people were working in their organizational context, and I saw quite a bit of ChatGPT. Those are kind of the three primaries that we saw for most of these students. And for a lot of them, it was because it was new. They hadn't had a chance to shop a lot of different AI tools. I did see a hand come up, but it went down.
Brian, it was me. Hello, I'm Janina. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely. Let's hear
All
it.
right. So I really thank you so much. I'm gonna say what everybody else is saying. Thank you so much for this perspective. I know you talked about that the demand question was met. They opened up another section, and I'm working with MBA students. But you were talking a little bit about that tension, right, between academic and workforce expectations. Number one, did you find that the students were all, so you had synchronous and asynchronous, right, and their weeks off. Did you find that they came to the lab kind of, if you want to dive deeper into what you were doing with those synchronous sessions, right? Were they hungry for a community to grapple this kind of debate? Or was it more of like the demo and I do, you do, and they were working on their individual projects? Like, were they looking for a community as well as their individual pursuits?
One thing so this was a cohort MBA group, so they were seeing each other in their other classes. And so they did have that community was already well. If anything, I was the new guy, right? They were dealing with the kind of a new instructor. What was cool about, so there was a little bit of overwhelmingly the presence of activities in the class were focused on the lab demos, and there was a lot of wow stuff, right? Specifically because once we made it through like prompt engineering, we're moving into things like building a chatbot and then creating really the one that really impressed them was agentic activity. They once we got into the agentic stuff and you could see it, like it's logging into an email, it's creating an email, it's sending an email. They were just like, whoa. So there, that was really, but what was cool about that was being present in that environment was it gave them the ability to have discussions about, oh, I can use this, I can take it here, or I think that's going to apply to my project, which is exactly what I wanted in this case. What, Mary, I want to address the lower division, and I know this. So there's a couple of so one thing I've been trying to recommend to the institutions where I teach is CompTIA actually has a fundamentals of AI course, and I would actually recommend going and looking at the course outline. I think it's probably one of the better uh, already built courses that has the early stage just when we think of AI literacy covered. And an advantage to working in that simulation environment is it chunks the course into a lot of pieces, right? So I don't want to sound like I'm always AI all the time, but let's recognize that some students are using it to keep from having to do work. And so one of the answers that I've come up with is I've got my classes are really in small pieces. Like every assignment's like very, very, very. I wouldn't have done this before AI because I can actually create lots of small pieces in the course. But it's one of those things that has students revisit the material over and over again, right? As opposed to, so it at least makes the cheating with AI a lot harder to do because you have to do it in smaller pieces. What's good about the CompTIA course is it's all built in a simulator. And so the students have to do a lot of small assignments, like in their prompt engineering phases and so forth with it. So I actually recommend that as a source for content, even if you're building your own course, because I think it's structured pretty interestingly, and it helps those lower division students quite a bit.
Thank you, Brian. We're going to go ahead and have to stop this session because we have a short break before our next one. We appreciate you. And I think there may have been a couple comments in the chat that I may have missed. So if you would like to reach out to Brian, please do so.
Please,
And from personal experience, know he's extremely responsive. So thank you all, and we'll see you in the next session.
thank you.